In a week where a few SEC teams went down, it was no trouble for Tennessee in the Vols season opener. A win over Virginia in Nashville, 49-13. Couple mistakes, couple of bumps in the road for Tennessee, but the result was never really in doubt. Full speed ahead, and now Austin Peay will come to Neyland Stadium on Saturday. Welcome into the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer, alongside the Knoxville News Sentinel's Adam Sparks and John Adams. Guys, you had the coverage from the Tennessee win on Saturday. I was down in Orlando monitoring from afar before LSU's game. And as I watched Tennessee, I think my general takeaway was they won by 36 points. It was a really inferior opponent, which we talked about last week, but game never in doubt. But the big thing was, I didn't even think this was peak Tennessee. Like, there were some bumps in the road, special teams miscues, drop pass here and there. I think Tennessee could play better than this, and that maybe ought to be scary to many of the teams on its schedule.
Yeah, they could play much better. You could do that glass half full or half empty. I think the offense was not, especially the passing game, was not a well-oiled machine. I think there's got to be some improvements there. And most of them were not Joe Milton's fault. I thought he ran the offense fine. I think he threw the ball fine. He had 30 attempts. I went back and watched every one of them, and I think I counted 4 bad passes out of the 30 attempts. One of them should have been picked off. 3 others were not great throws. But he was pretty good. The passing game, they've got some issues on the offensive line. They've got to figure out which will cost them in SEC games if they don't get them fixed by then. Cooper Ray's coming back will help that quite a bit. But yeah, they didn't play great, and they still won by quite a lot. I thought it was a pretty solid opener. They could have won that game by 60 if they're playing well. If you wanted to be if you're the type that worry about a lot of things, you could say there were some problems with the offense that seemed to be carried over from the Orange Bowl. I know they had a great game there, and they won that game over Clemson, but things stalled out more with this offense than it did most of last season. And we saw that some in the Orange Bowl. We saw that some in the Vanderbilt game. We saw that some in this game. So they need to fix some things on offense. The running game was really good. Defense was better than you could imagine. Again, it's against Virginia, so we'll see. But I think the call of depth that the coaches have made all season on the defensive side, I think was heated. I think they have more bodies and they have more talent on that side of the ball than they've had the previous 2 years. And that was maybe the biggest plus for me.
I think there's a tendency with Josh Heupel's offense. It's been so productive, led the nation in scoring and yards per game last season, that the standards are so high. So when Tennessee doesn't gets a ball and doesn't score, there's criticism follows. I just think it's natural because the standards are so high. And yeah, my assessment was similar to Adam's. There was a period there after the first scoring drive to early in the second quarter where Tennessee was just kind of sputtering on offense. But overall, when I looked at what Joe Milton did, his stats were good. And probably the best pass he threw was dropped by Ramel Keaton. So, yeah, I thought I came away from that game thinking Tennessee was better than I thought it would be. And a lot of that had to do, Austin mentioned it, had to do with the defense. I just forget the stats. It just really passed the eye test to me. It just looked quicker, stronger. It just looked different than what Tennessee recent defenses have looked.
Yeah, Blake, and I'll just add that, you said you asked the question to begin with, is Tennessee better than we thought they would be? And John sort of said that. I know John wrote that in a column following the game. And I had fans ask me the same question. I don't feel like Tennessee is going to be better than I thought they would be after this game. I feel exactly the same as I did before. There's really no change. If you look back at some of the bold predictions or whatever we call them that I wrote right before the opener, there were 3 big ones I think that I've kind of settled on through most of the preseason. Was that Tennessee would be somewhere around a 9-3 record. I still feel that way after seeing the opener. I felt like Tennessee would maybe take a small step back on offense, but take a step forward on defense. So the gap would close there a little bit between those two units, but they would still be a little more balanced. I feel the same way about that now after the opener. Offense looked not quite as good as you would want. Defense looked better. And the third thing was I thought Tennessee would have a better chance of beating Georgia at Neyland Stadium than I thought they would have at beating Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And after seeing Tennessee play, and especially after seeing Georgia and Alabama play, I feel just as good about that prediction as well.
Well, let's continue with that because I think that's a good thought. Better, worse, or exactly the same. And I realize we're getting into week one overreaction territory, but let's face it, guys, it's a game against Austin Peay next week. The coaches and the players will tell you can't overlook any opponent. Well, we're podcast hosts, so we can overlook opponents, and that's what we're going to do. And so that allows us to engage in these type of debates. Adam, you say exactly the same, more or less, as what you thought they would be coming into the season. I'll log a vote for that as well. I believe I was predicting Tennessee at 9-3 coming into the year. I will stand by that. Wouldn't be totally shocked if it's 10-2. I wouldn't be shocked if it's 8-4. I guess I'd be more surprised if it's 8-4 than if it's 10-2. But I still like 9-3. Georgia and Alabama, I still have in the likely loss column, and Texas A&M at home. I think that's going to be a tough game. Texas A&M had no trouble in its week one game against New Mexico. And even if you win that one, that could be offset by some head-scratching loss somewhere else along the line. So like you, Adam, I guess even though Tennessee crushed Virginia, we all expected they would crush Virginia. So my opinion hasn't changed a ton. I'm the same at 9-3. How about you, John? Are you reevaluating your expectations in any way after this game?
No, I thought Tennessee would go 10-2, and I still think it will go 10-2, but it will be a stronger 10-2 than I envisioned in preseason. Part of that has to do with the opposition. I thought South Carolina could be a real challenge. Even though it's at Neyland Stadium, I thought it could be a difficult game, mainly because of Spencer Rattler, quarterback. Watching South Carolina play against North Carolina, just awful. No offensive line. I could see Tennessee beating South Carolina by 3 or 4 touchdowns. So I also wasn't overly impressed with either Alabama and Georgia, teams that are considered national championship contenders. So the standard is very high, and maybe I'm too critical, but I just didn't think they were. I didn't think Georgia was as good as it was last year, going back to an opening game. And Alabama was about what I thought it was. So I just feel better about Tennessee's chances of going 10-2 now than I did in preseason.
How about a couple takeaways that really grabbed your attention, guys? I'll throw a couple out there and see if you had a similar opinion in these areas, and maybe if there was something else that caught your eye. Number one, I thought Jalen Wright looked fantastic. He's been a pretty good running back the last couple years, but hasn't had too many 100-yard games. I think this was just the third of his career. He went for 115 against Virginia. Probably could have gone for 200 if he would have had, say, 20 carries. He only had a dozen carries. He didn't need, any more than that. That was plenty. But he rushed for 115 yards. Was impressed by the way he attacked with the ball in his hands. And then I thought the Tennessee pass rush looked good enough to give me some optimism in that area. Tyler Barron, James Pierce had a couple sacks apiece. I've said before, I think that pass rush is going to be important to provide support for the back end of the defense. So those were a couple things that grabbed my eye. John, how about you? Anything that really caught your attention as being particularly impressive to you in this?
Well, I mentioned it earlier, but just the overall play of the defensive front, particularly the front four, they just look quicker and stronger. And they mounted a pass rush. I know it's against Virginia, and Virginia was so limited offensively, but Tennessee looked really aggressive up front. I like what I saw there. I was curious about the offensive line. Virginia's strength probably was its defensive front, although it was playing without its best player. And I thought Tennessee controlled the line of scrimmage pretty well on offense without Cooper Mays. I thought that was significant. I watched Ollie, I'm going to call him Ollie Mays, Ollie Lane. I watched him a few times making pretty nice blocks, controlling his man. So I was impressed with that. And I think we're seeing now the backfield. Nobody forgot about Dylan Sampson, but I think you think of Jalen Wright, Jabari Small, 1-2 punch, but I think it's a 1-2-3 punch. Sampson, because of his speed, can give Tennessee a little something extra, a little something different. So I just, I liked all of those things, and it was impossible to judge the secondary. Is it better? I just couldn't tell against Virginia because its passing game was so limited. Quarterback Tony Muskett, unfortunately, was injured, but that was hardly surprising if you watch the first couple of series that eventually he would go down and not get back up because he was under so much pressure.
Do you think after the results we saw in week one, Florida looked just abysmal against Utah, and neither one of us had big expectations for Florida coming into the season. That hasn't changed, obviously, after week one. And then we saw South Carolina just get picked apart by North Carolina. You mentioned it, John. South Carolina had no offensive line. Questions about that entering the season, even more questions about that after they got crushed by the Tar Heels. North Carolina sacked Spencer Rattler 9 times. And so those had kind of been the circled games in the month of September, with UTSA, I guess, sort of lurking in the shadows, but UTSA lost a week one game against Houston. I mean, at what point will you guys feel like, do you think we really know what Tennessee has here? Because, this is a pretty favorable September schedule. It already was. Now I think it's breaking even better for Tennessee. I'm not sure I'll have my mind made up on what type of Tennessee team this is until that October 14th game against Texas A&M. But is there something that's standing out to you guys in the first month of the season as still maybe being an interesting test, even after what we saw after week one?
The atmosphere in the swamp and how that's handled. I think that's Florida's not really, really good. But I've said it on this pod before, is that you just cannot underestimate what playing in the swamp, how difficult that can be. We'll see how Cooper Mays is, the center, whether he's healthy or he's not playing. The Florida game, you're going to have issues at center because they've had issues at center so far. You potentially could have issues at left guard. So then you have communication issues. You have the crowd at the swamp. You need to figure out a few things on offense to make that more efficient. And so that could be a test. Tennessee should win that game, but it being on the road, I think, changes things quite a bit. But yeah, aside from that, so far, just week one, a lot of the opponents on their schedule don't look as good as we thought they would, including what John mentioned before about South Carolina. And so Tennessee, I feel fine about Tennessee. I don't feel as good about their opponents. So they're probably not going to have that many hurdles until they get to mid-October. October could be difficult, and South Carolina could get better. I think Texas A&M is going to be good, and Alabama is going to be really, really good. So it will get tough during the middle of the year. But this is the way that you want to line this up. Playing a Power 5 in Virginia, that's a bad Power 5. That's what you want because you feel good about the win. But it really wasn't that difficult, and that's what you're going to get through most of September.
When Adam was talking about the atmosphere in the swamp, and we know it can be very, very hostile and very difficult for an opposing team, it made me think maybe, how you pre-plan things like there's going to be a white out, or there's going to be an orange out, or checkerboard kneeling and all that stuff. What if Tennessee fans pretended that Tennessee was the opponent and made as much noise as possible when Tennessee had the ball, just to get it ready for a hostile environment? I think that would be a real plus going in that Florida game.
I'm seeing a column forming John, as you try to come up with some ideas for this Austin P game. You really can't. Hard to make this, more than what it is. I'm seeing maybe a Friday column about how Tennessee fans should turn on its own on the game this week and prepare the Vols for the Swamp.
Well, in the Virginia game, when Nico came into the game, there was like this loud roar from the crowd, and they had to tell everybody to be quiet. So maybe they had the right idea already, John. They were ahead of you.
Yeah, maybe they were.
Adam, we'd lost your audio and internet connection earlier. Listeners may have realized Adam went missing for about 5 minutes. But now that we have you back, I want to get your thoughts on something John and I weighed in on earlier about the Virginia game. We highlighted some guys or position groups that grabbed our attention. I mentioned Jalen Wright going for over 100 yards rushing. I thought he looked really good. I mentioned the pass rush, getting 4 sacks between James Pierce and Tyler Barron. John had good things to say about the defensive line as well. What maybe, if you were to give out a couple game balls or whatever you want to call it, what direction would you go with? Who kind of had your eye from Saturday's performance? Maybe, I guess it could be expected, but I was thinking maybe even more so something you were on the fence about that you thought, okay, this looked good.
Kamal Hadden, who was lambasted some late last season, at corner when he was, there was some visuals people had of like South Carolina, Tennessee down like 30 points, and he's celebrating plays. He got burned a few times late in the year. Kamal Hadden looked really, really good. And I know like Pro Football Focus grades are not completely scientific, but I think he had the best coverage grades of anybody on there. And he made some plays. There were a few times I know Tennessee fans will listen to this and say he needs to turn his head around to see the ball coming. But, against an inferior opponent, granted, Kamal Hadden was pretty good. Secondary was fine. And obviously we all had questions about them. Keenan Peely, I wondered what the coaches would say. And Keenan Peely had a couple of big hits earlier in the game. He's the middle linebacker, BYU transfer. Had a couple of big hits in the game, dropped into coverage a little bit. I wanted to see if he was athletic enough to run around. I was on the fence. I thought he looked pretty good, but then it seemed like you didn't see much of him after the first couple of drives. He didn't play that much because they were subbing in real quickly early in that game. But Josh Heupel today at the press conference said Keenan Peely got a game ball. Now you say, well, he made a few plays, but he didn't make many. Why was that? And I think a lot of it was this is a new player who I think was making the majority of the calls at linebacker. He was operating he was the quarterback of the defense. And as a new guy to do that, I think they were sort of tipping their cap at him that he did that well. And it allowed Aaron Beasley at weak side linebacker at will to run around and just make plays and not have to worry as much about managing the defense. So I thought that was a really good sign. It was a pretty decent day for the transfers that they have. I need to see more out of those guys, but so much. I'm talking about defense because so much of my attention was on defense. They played, I think, 25 guys on defense. They rolled in a lot of guys, and 25 guys with what I would call the first team defense. They played a lot more guys than that, but I think I counted probably 25 guys at this point, but they will probably play in the first team rotation at Florida. And they could not say that in past years.
That's one of the most surprising things I've heard for the entire weekend, that Keenan Peely got a game ball. I didn't even know. I forgot he was out there.
John's taking the game ball back.
I really do think it was intangibles. They need intangibles from him. They need him to be the opposite of Jeremy Banks in some ways. And I think in the ways that he is opposite of Jeremy Banks, they want to tip their cap to that. Now he needs to do like the playing style of Jeremy Banks because Jeremy Banks made a lot of plays, but I think that's sort of what they were praising him for.
I couldn't see those intangibles during the game.
They weren't in the box score.
No, intangibles.
They need a column for that.
Yeah,
that's what the game ball's
for.
Good. I guess.
Well, good for him.
Yeah. You mentioned, Adam, the reaction from the crowd when Nico came in. Of course, that was a much anticipated debut, even though it was in mop-up duty. opportunity to maybe to see more of him this week against Austin Peay if that game gets lopsided early. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on whether Nico redshirts or not this year? Of course, you can play in up to 4 games now and still use it as a redshirt season. Didn't used to be the case. Used to be if you wanted a redshirt, you didn't play. Now you can play in 4 and redshirt. You think there's a decision there within the staff? Have you got an inkling on what way Tennessee's going to head, or just take it as it goes? And if they need him in more than 4, if there's a chance to play him in more than 4, they do it. What direction do you think they'll go there?
I think circumstances will dictate that he plays more than the 4 games. 'Cause he's already played 1. He'll play a lot against Austin Peay. He'll play a lot against UConn. He should play a lot against UTSA. Well, that's 4 right there. That's 4 non-conference games. And yeah, Vanderbilt should be a lopsided score. Missouri could be. John thinks South Carolina could be. There's just going to be at least a couple of SEC games that may look like a score what we saw in the Virginia game. And if that's the case, you're going to play him. There's so much more to gain by him getting live action game snaps than anything that you could gain by getting him a year of eligibility back. Yeah, I mean, a 5-star quarterback is not supposed to be in school for 5 years. You're not supposed to redshirt and hang around. Either you're somewhat of a bust, somewhat of a disappointment, or you're an NFL player that comes out before your eligibility is done. And if so he's going to be one of those two things. That he's probably going to compete to be the starter. He's going to compete to be the starter next year, maybe with a guy that they get in the portal or something like that. And so they need him to play a lot. I'm curious to see how much he plays against Austin Peay, because I was a little surprised that Gaston Moore came in at the end of that game. I just assumed as soon as Nico gets out there, you give him absolutely every snap that he can get. But they pulled him after a couple of series. He threw 3 passes, looked somewhat comfortable. Maybe when he tucked it a couple times and ran the ball and took a couple of hits, maybe they thought, okay, we busted the seal here and he played, so we're going to get him out of there. But I would hope Austin Peay, let's say this is a 35, 40-point game at halftime. I wish they would just play him the entire second half. I don't think that's going to happen based on what happened the other day, but let him do a lot. Let him throw the ball. Let him run the offense.
What do you think, John? Should Tennessee redshirt Nico? I kind of side with Adam there. If you got a 5-star guy, you can't really, nobody should be thinking about his 5th year, because by his 5th year, he's either, as Adam put it, a bust or in the NFL. I think Tennessee fans obviously hope for the latter and may well be accurate in thinking that. So I'm with Adam. What do you think? Should we be toying around with the idea of a redshirt season here for Nico and only play him in 4 games?
Well, based on what I've heard about him, and he only played a few plays in the game Saturday, but based on what I've heard, he might be here 3 years. So, I wouldn't even think about redshirting. I would think you've got to have, in case Joe Milton goes down, you got to have him as ready as you can be. And I kind of agree with Adam on this. I would like to get him as many game reps as I could, just for the unfortunate possibility that Milton might be injured and Nico would have to come in and start a game. So I don't know. I'd be too concerned about getting a 3rd guy ready. I'd want to get Nico ready to play.
All right, we'll leave it there, guys. We'll have a lengthier discussion, I think, next week when Tennessee prepares for the Florida game. But this one will be against Austin Peay, Neyland Stadium, 5 o'clock on Saturday. John will have the commentary. Adam will have the game coverage and the pregame coverage. You can find it all at knoxnews.com. If you like what you hear on the Volunteer State podcast, we'd appreciate it if you give us a subscribe. Or you could give us a rating or review. Those ratings and reviews help us find more listeners. We're glad to have you here listening this week, and we'll be back with you next week. Thanks for listening to the Volunteer State.